Strike finally goes to meet up with Wardle. He'd mentioned on the phone that he'd be willing to sell info in exchange for getting a copy of the official report on Lula's death. Once there, Strike starts to talk about this seemingly unrelated case. However, we're now 7 pages into this 20-page chapter and on page 143 of 522, so excuse me if I'm less than thrilled about reading any of this. Unless this ties back to Lula's case, I don't care. Hello and welcome to Precontation Point's video Snark. If you came here because you thought that this was an audiobook, please stick around and maybe learn some reading and listening comprehension skills. I read books, discuss what went wrong, and how they can possibly be fixed. I'm continuing my read-through of The Cuckoo's Calling by Robert Galbraith. Not the first video, go check out the others, links are posted below. This book contains harsh scenes that some people might find upsetting. Viewer discretion is advised. Chapter 16. The chapter opens with Strike going back to the university so that he can shower before taking a left turn through his mom's religious beliefs. Literally none of this is important, but we must wade through the filth of the first page before getting back to the plot. Strike calls up John to ask about this mysterious friend from rehab. John doesn't know why Strike is interested in this woman since Mrs. B heard a man's voice, not a woman, but Strike says that it's as a witness. John then says that he's at his mom's and that Evan went to see Yvette, which is quite upsetting to John. But also, I was under the impression that Yvette had died following the death of Lula, but I was mistaken. She's actually dying, probably from the same thing that she had the surgery for, and she's in insanely poor health right now. John still doesn't understand the business with the friend from rehab. Strike explains about how on her last day alive, Lula had dragged this friend out to the place only to spend about 15 minutes with her. When somebody dies, literally anything could be the clue as to why they're now dead. However, John thinks that Lula abandoning a friend 15 minutes into a meeting isn't that out of character for her. Strike insists that John still isn't thrilled about him chasing after this mystery girl and instead mentions that he's going to get the police file from the lead detective later. And John's notes about the CCTV footage were helpful. John says that he's still trying to arrange a lunch with Mrs. B later that week, so he'll ring Strike's secretary about it later. Immediately following this, the narration pauses yet again to describe a hostel for the homeless. By the time that the narration gets around to a bedraggled youth standing outside, I kinda don't care. Should have led with that. Inside, Strike introduces himself to the guy behind the desk and says that he's trying to find Lula's friend. The man says that her name is Rochelle, but that she's not there anymore. Doesn't know where she is, but suggests that some lady there might know. Carrie Ann mentions that she's seen Rochelle around a bit, but calls her a lying liar who lies. Says that Rochelle insisted that Lula left her everything, but that's obviously not true, or else why else would she be hanging around there? She goes on to say that she's pretty sure that Rochelle stole everything that she claimed Lula gave/bought for her. As Carrie Ann goes on to say that Lula and Rochelle weren't even that close, the man behind the desk says that Lula would often pick Rochelle up in a fancy car, that it would cause tension in the hostel. But he does say that Rochelle had been a patient at some hospital because of her psychotic episodes, but isn't sure if she's still there or not. Strike leaves since there's little more that these people can tell him. As he heads off to a pub, he picks up a paper that John had mentioned with an article about how Evan went to visit Yvette on her deathbed, but there's not much to be learned from the article that you couldn't get from the headline itself. As he's reading it, he gets a message from Robin telling him about the article, which seems kind of bizarre to slip in, but whatever. Chapter 17. Although the chapter opens with Robin, her business here is literally unimportant. As soon as we get to the second page, the narration jumps back to Strike standing outside the club Mac had been in the night Lula had died, and no mention of Robin is given again. Here, the narration pauses to give us a bit more info about Mac. He was a gangster from LA who turned to a rapping career instead. Robin mentioned in a previous chapter that Mac had some mentions of Lula in a couple of his songs and that he'd mentioned her in interviews. Strike has now confirmed all of this info. When it came out that Mac was going to be living a floor below Lula, his press went wild with this info. Strike looks around the area for a bit before he pauses to have a cuppa. As he's doing this, Robin calls and tells him that John arranged for a meeting between Strike and Tansy Paguzzi. He asks for her to try again to get in touch with Mr. B, but she says that his team told her that Mr. B is currently in LA. He also wants her to try and get in touch with the fashion designer, too. There's also this really dumb bit where Strike's loan shark, whoever he is, won't stop calling, and Strike kind of wants Robin to call the guy and tell him where to stick it. But then he also tells her that the death threats arrive on Monday and to please file it away with the others. After hanging up, Strike then goes to look at a different club and then goes to the area where he thinks that Somei lives. The narration never bothers to explain why any of this is important, so I've decided that it's not. Strike finally goes to meet up with Wardle. He'd mentioned on the phone that he'd be willing to sell info in exchange for getting a copy of the official report on Lula's death. Once there, Strike starts to talk about this seemingly unrelated case. However, we're now 7 pages into this 20-page chapter and on page 143 of 522, so excuse me if I'm less than thrilled about reading any of this. Unless this ties back to Lula's case, I don't care. The info is about some guy who'd stabbed somebody else last month. The police know who it was, but not his current location, so Strike gives them enough information for the police to find him on their own. Strike then asks for insider info about Lula, not the hogwash being bantered in the press. When he mentions that John hired him to look into this, Wardle's bad mood gets even worse. Wardle asks if John is so obsessed with the CCTV footage and says that he's pretty sure that those guys are going around and trying to steal expensive cars, not pushing young models off of balconies. Wardle gives more info about the movements of the 2 men in the footage, proof that they actually did look into things a bit more than previously thought. However, Wardle makes no secret of what he thinks of John's comments about everything. He's also of the opinion that even if they did manage to track this man down, no matter what they might have been doing in the area, there's no way that they did it. The evidence in Lula's apartment didn't give way for anybody to have been there. Wardle then gets even angrier when Strike mentions Tansy. Upon Strike's insistence, he starts to explain about what happened when he got there about 20 minutes after Lula's fall. Tansy insisted that she not only heard an argument 2 floors away, but also that she saw Lula fall past the window. Wardle, however, says that he was in the apartment and knows that the windows are made from this extreme sound and heat-proof stuff. Except for the lights of the police cars on the street, he wouldn't have known anything was going on. However, Tansy doubled down on everything and kept insisting that she'd heard stuff. Wardle thinks that she's nothing more than an addict who'd stirred too much over her lifetime. The fact was hammered in by how they'd found untouched lines in her bathroom. She'd literally been interrupted by Lula falling. Whoops. The 2 of them briefly talk about Wilson, but Wardle says that they were quick to dismiss him as being anything of actual importance. Strike asks about the middle flat, the one that Mac was supposed to have been in. They bring up the roses that Mr. B had arranged for him, the ones that the first officer on scene had accidentally smashed. Wardle doesn't exactly have answers for why Mr. B had given the rapper the flowers, but he thinks that the reason why Mr. B threw such a fuss over the destruction of the flowers was to hide the fact that his wife was high as a kite. Wardle continues on to say that if Mr. B had pushed Lula over, there's no way that Tansy would have kept her strung-out mouth shut about the entire thing. He acknowledges that for an older man, Mr. B can move pretty fast, but it would be pushing it to get back downstairs without being spotted by Wilson. They don't think that he had anything to do with Lula's death. When asked about the forensics, Wardle admits that they knew that it was a suicide within the first 24 hours, but because of all of the attention her death was creating, they went the extra mile. He mentions that he did interviews with Mac, but it wasn't a long interview since Mac was still clearly adjusting to the time difference between LA and London. Wardle said that the man was nicer than Mr. B, but the bar is kind of on the ground with that one. Strike finally asks about Evan, which is the absolute cherry on top of everything at this point. Wardle scoffs and recounts how the junkie had run off to rehab the day after Lula's death. He circles back to the argument that the 2 had in the club the night of and how Evan had left with that wolf head mask on. However, it's the mask that's throwing people off, because how do you know that it was actually Evan in it? Evan's driver for the night tried to take him to Lula's flat, but upon seeing the press outside, Evan instead asked to be taken to his dealer. Wardle says that he knows that the drug dealer would lie for Evan, but that a neighbor saw Evan. After shooting up, Evan was upset to find that the driver and car were gone, if only because the person who was in charge of the car service account was Lula, not Evan. So he started walking, where he apparently took some matches from a woman who later identified him as Evan. When Strike asked if Lula left a note, Wardle said no. Blames her jumping on an untreated bipolar disorder, that her earlier fight with Evan pushed her over the edge, so she jumped. Wardle says that he has to go, but Strike asks about the official file. Wardle says that he'll only give Strike the file so long as they can catch the other criminal, the guy who stabbed somebody. Chapter 18. The next day, Robin tells Strike that both agents for Evan and Sumray will be en route. He says that he'll talk with John and try to get an audience with both of them later. Robin goes on to say that she found an article about how Fred and Tansy Paguzzi are getting a divorce. Robin then asks how it is that Strike managed to get any info from the police, to which he replies that he is friends with a different officer, that they met when they were stationed in Afghanistan in the military police. Military police did not tally with Matthew's impression of a charlatan or a waster. Wow, it's almost like Matthew doesn't know diddly squat about Strike or something. I can kind of understand where Matthew's coming from about how his fiancée is working for this bloke that she reports is living in his office, that their first literal encounter included him knocking her over, and in an attempt to rescue her, resulted in him grabbing her by the chest on accident. But at the same time, Robin herself has barely spent any time with Strike and doesn't actually know him as a person. Shrike reads the article on the way to his meeting with Tansy. In it, there's a life with a lot of sexual harassment claims and a troubled marriage. The article closes off by implying that the troubled life of the Bagutsis was part of the reason why Lula jumped. Shrike meets Tansy at a really fancy restaurant, the kind where they won't let you in unless you're dressed correctly. In there, Tansy asks if he's really Johnny Rugby's son, to which Shrike says that it's what the DNA test said. Tansy goes on to say that she doesn't want to go public after her name was smeared through the mud the first time, but she wants somebody to prove that she wasn't lying. But then she circles back to Shrike's father, to which he explains that he's only met his dad exactly twice. Any actual progress, either with the plot or Strike's actually trying to interview Tansy, is interrupted by Tansy's sister Ursula. She thinks that Strike is trash and that Tansy shouldn't continue to talk to people like him about the entire thing. However, Tansy is adamant that she needs to explain what happened, which makes me wonder why she brought Ursula along. We finally get around to the actual interview. Tansy said that she didn't know Lula all that well, that Mr. and Mrs. B were hardly the hip, young, cool crowd that somebody like Lula would have been part of. It was only after Lula said that Tansy heard that her husband had gotten himself invited to a party that Lula had been at. And yes, he does think that her gross old husband was more interested in chasing after tail than her. She goes out of her way to say this and to establish that Freddie was more interested in black girls than blondes. John interrupts to say that Freddie had come calling to his mom a while ago, wanting to have the rights to make a biopic about Lula. Oh, he framed it all nice and everything, but John makes it known that he sees Freddie for the skis he is. Both John and Strike think that Freddie knows something about Lula that he's keeping under wraps. John thinks that Freddie would love to talk to the family again, but is keeping his distance since John is Tansy's lawyer for the divorce. Shrike then asks Tansy about how long that she'd lived in the flat before Lula moved in and about the previous tenants in the middle unit. This is interrupted by the sisters randomly gushing over some lady's coat. It is the most bizarre cutaway. Like, yes, this is how real conversations can go, especially when somebody is now 4 glasses of wine in, but at the same time, it makes for a bad story to randomly cut into the flow. Tansy then begins to tell the story of what happened that night. The first thing Shrike notes is that she's changed her story from what she told the police. Originally, she said that she got up to use the toilet, but now she says that she went to get a glass of water. The rest of it is pretty unchanged. She heard Lula saying that something was already done, a male voice calling Lula a lying B-word, and then witnessing Lula falling past the window. After that, she ran from the flat to go get the security man on duty at the time, Wilson, whom she also views as the help and thus beneath her, since she thought that the murderer was still upstairs. Freddie then came downstairs and dragged her back into their unit. This is interrupted yet again by John getting a call from his secretary and girlfriend Allison. As he leaves, Tansy turns to Strike and asks if he knows about the love triangle going on between Allison, John, and John's uncle and senior lawyer at the firm, Tony. The workplace drama isn't actually important, but it makes Strike think of how people love to talk and gossip, but the only question is of how to get them to open up. When John comes back, Shrike turns back to the soundproofed windows and the cocaine. Tansy insists that the windows were cracked open because it was stuffy. She also says that she'd done the drugs earlier that night during the party because the party guests were dull. Shrike asks Tansy what she thinks happened to the mystery man in Lula's apartment. Tansy doesn't know and blames the slow-to-arrive police for the fact that he slipped away during that time. She gets upset over the entire thing, and John assures her that they believe her. He then circles back around to what and where Freddie was when Tansy saw Lula fall, and then what Freddie might have known when his wife went screaming through the bedroom to get downstairs, because if Freddie had been asleep at the time, he went from sleep to chasing his wife downstairs within seconds and 0 processing time, which I hope I don't have to explain to you is kind of odd. Shrike then asks about the voice she heard if she could identify it if heard again. This leads to Tansy complaining about Evan, which snowballs into her straight up complaining about the terrible company Lula kept. The other model friend that Evan spent the rest of the night with the night Lula died, the terrible makeup artist, a homeless girl, Rochelle. There's a lot of underlying racism when Rochelle is brought up, but Tansy says that Rochelle was hanging out at the back of Lula's funeral. After that, Tansy asks for the check and promptly hands it over to John to pay. As the sisters are getting their coats on, a man comes in. He's Ursula's husband and another lawyer at the firm where John works. He's angered that the girls are spending time with John and is quick to usher them from the restaurant. John explains all of this to Shrike after they're gone and says that they don't want anything else sullying Tansy's name, that John will probably get a stern talking to because of this. Shrike leaves the restaurant and walks for a while before he stops and listens to the recording of the interview he made with his phone. As he plays back Tansy recounting the argument she heard upstairs, he thinks about the wild look of terror in her face. No matter what people might have said about Tansy, and no matter what lies Tansy took into that part, he knows for certain that Tansy both heard and saw something horrific that night. Part 3, Chapter 1, or as I've been counting it, Chapter 19. The chapter opens with Strike thinking about the rain. Rain, of which they have in abundance because they live in the UK. This goes on for a freaking half page. Robin helps Stripe wrap a present for his nephew and then tells him about the job interview she's got lined up. However, there's undertones in the narration that make it seem like she'd rather intentionally flub the interview simply so that she can keep working with Strike. She then leaves for the weekend. As Strike is contemplating what's worse, smoking in the rain or quitting completely, he gets a ring from Wordle that they caught the stabber. Wordle wants to wait until morning to hand over Lula's file, but Strike insists that it be sometime tonight. The file contains copies of hard evidence that the police had found DNA from her apartment, a copy of the autopsy report, Lula's medical report from the past year, including that she'd been on bipolar meds. But one odd thing that stands out is that the corpse photos show that Lula was in a sequin top and pants, which is different from the mini dress she'd been photographed wearing as she came home that night. The police had found half a line of cocaine on the flat marble rim of Tansy's bath and a small plastic bag of the drug hidden inside a box of Tampax in the cabinet above the sink. Okay, but why were they digging through Tansy's tampon box? Tansy's statement is pretty much as it had been described up until this point, so there's no new info there. Freddie's statement is also pretty much in agreement with everything said about him. He had been asleep until his wife started screaming. He was upset over the flowers given as a gesture of friendship because Freddie wanted to cast the rapper in some movie. However, the business with Freddie goes a tiny bit deeper. Despite his insistence on trying to get to know Lula better, nothing seemed to be actually working. One thing stands out in Shark's mind as he reads over these statements. Where exactly is the bathroom in the middle flat? Because Tansy kept shifting her narrative and he isn't quite certain, and yes, it apparently does matter quite a bit. He next reads over the counting of Evan's whereabouts at night, but it's nothing that the readers don't already know. The dude was wandering around wearing a wolf head mask, and it could have been literally anybody under there. As Strike thinks about Evan, he thinks about how vile he finds drug users. It was kind of hinted at when Strike recounted his youth spent bouncing around with his mom and Lucy, but Mom was some kind of drug addict. Strike spent some of his youth basically squatting in drug dens, so he knows what different drugs do to people. He doesn't think that heroin, Evan's drug of choice, would sound evident to a murderous rage, but he also thinks about how his mom OD'd from the same drug in a corner and nobody noticed she died for 6 hours. Then the author apparently thought that there wasn't enough film noir aesthetic going on, so she had Strike stand at the window while smoking and thinking deep thoughts. Not about the case, but about how much his life sucks. It's pointless, but it was only one paragraph, so good job at keeping it short. Returning to the file, even the narration brushes over Wilson's statement. It pauses to mention that there is nothing about Kieran in the file. Now that we've gone over everything that we already know, as if we hadn't read all of it ourselves, it finally dives into some new stuff, mainly the two women that Lula spent her last day with, Sierra, another model, and a makeup artist named Bronny. Bronny mentions that while Lula was looking forward to Mac's arrival, the model seemed anxious but refused to talk about what was bothering her. Up next is a statement from Yvette. She's of the opinion that nothing was wrong when her daughter had visited her that afternoon, and goes on to say that it had been icy that night. Maybe Lula sipped, which is kind of an odd thing for a mother to say. Strike skims over John's statement, which matches up with what he'd already told Strike when he'd been hired. Then it's time for Tony Landry's statement, who is the uncle of John and Lula. Not much narrative time is spent on that, other than that he'd visited Yvette at the same time as John and Lula, but that he'd gone off to attend a lawyer educational class thing, whatever. He turns his attention to the phone record. She'd called Evan first thing that morning, and then Sierra a little later. Then 2 hours of nothing, followed by her frantically trying to reach both Evan as well as Tony. Strike finds the timing of this odd, since it would have been when she'd been back at her flat with Sierra and Bernie, but neither woman mentioned Lula trying frantically to call anybody. Since she'd been trying to reach her uncle, Strike turns back to Tony's statement. In it, he said that he'd missed all of her calls and didn't know why she'd been so insistent on trying to reach him. By the time that he realized that his phone had blown up with missed calls, he didn't attempt to call it back, figuring correctly that she'd be at a club. He then turns to the copy of the guest logbook from the building. Wilson wasn't exactly great at making people stand out, and the security guy was never marked as having actually left. Strike is also frustrated that the only page from the book is from the day of Lula's death. He was hoping that he might find Rochelle's name in there. As he turns to her emails, he thinks about how abstract that Lula seemed up until right now. But as he reads through these messages full of typos and inside jokes, he begins to see Lula for a person, not a pretty face a million miles tall on a billboard. He was hoping reading through the emails would give him some insight as to who did it, but instead all he finds is a life interrupted. He saw now why John Barristow insisted that his sister had no thought of death. The girl who had typed out these words emerged as a warm-hearted friend, sociable, impulsive, busy, and glad to be so, enthusiastic about her job, excited, as Barristow had said, about the prospect of a trip to Morocco. He finds a note from Lula to Samai begging the designer to make Rochelle something nice for her birthday, which makes him look at the statement Samai gave. He'd been in Japan the week prior to her death and arrived the day of. The police hadn't really questioned the idea that he was in bed following this trip. Now that he's looked at everything, Strike then goes to bed. Thanks for listening to my book Snark on YouTube. New videos are up every Monday, but stick around because I sometimes drop random videos on other days too. Just as a reminder, even if you can't financially support me, there are other ways to help me out. The first is watching this video as well as all my other videos. It's also important to like and subscribe. Finally, you can share this video with all of your friends so that they can help as well. If you're already caught up with all of my videos, you can go to Tumblr for my main book, Snarks, always free and updated every morning. Newly added to Patreon is to become a member without paying. You'll get access to the same things on Tumblr, but on Patreon. Also new is a 1-week free Patreon trial, so be sure to check that out. Special thanks to Dawn, Phoebe, and Nikki for supporting me on Patreon already. If you want to hear your name in my video next week, either support me on Patreon or make a one-time donation. Do you like my snark so much that you want me to snark your writing? I do that too. For just $6 per chapter, I will tell you how awful that your writing is. But not to worry if you feel like you couldn't take the criticism. I also offer regular book editing as well, just $10 per chapter. You can contact me on any of my social media platforms if you have further questions. If you want to read some of the things that I've written, you can purchase my works on Amazon. I have a slew of spicy short stories and 2 full-length novels. I also frequently run flash sales on my stories, and if you don't follow me on any social media, you might want to do so just so you can know when I might be offering things for free. Links for everything will be posted below. See you next week, guys!